Crazy Eddie represented an electronics retail chain that achieved remarkable popularity throughout the New York region during the 1980s. In today's market, the closest equivalent would be Best Buy. Picture a hyperactive, eccentric take on Best Buy. At their zenith in 1988, Crazy Eddie ranked as the nation's sixth largest electronics retailer, commanding nearly 4% of the marketplace. Given their trajectory, industry observers predicted they'd soon climb even higher on that ranking. The previous year, they posted sales exceeding $350 million, 6 times their figure from the decade's beginning. They'd expanded to roughly 40 stores, primarily concentrated in New York, but stretching southward to Philadelphia. Yet their brand recognition far exceeded what you'd expect for an operation of this magnitude. Virtually everyone in the New York metropolitan area recognized the Crazy Eddie name, thanks to an exceptionally successful advertising campaign spanning over 10 years. Within moments of hearing their commercials, you grasp the concept. Audio equipment, video systems, component setups, everything discounted during Crazy Eddie's promotions. The catchphrase? Crazy Eddie's prices were so insane, they defied logic. I'm almost embarrassed to admit how much time I've devoted to reviewing these advertisements. They share common traits: boisterous, gimmicky, cheaply produced, yet oddly captivating. By the campaign's end, they'd created over 7,000 commercials broadcast on television and radio, explaining their extraordinary brand awareness. Most viewers have probably encountered something in popular culture influenced by these advertisements. They pop up periodically in various references. The first example that springs to mind is Malfunctioning Eddie from Futurama, a character clearly inspired by the campaign. Let me clarify an important detail, as it's a common misconception. The person appearing in the commercials wasn't actually Crazy Eddie. That was Jerry Carroll, a local radio personality hired as the spokesperson, uninvolved in the company's fraudulent activities. This is the real Crazy Eddie. His given name was Eddie Antar, and the Antar family controlled the business. Eddie launched it with his father and a cousin in 1969 as a single Brooklyn electronics shop called Sights and Sounds. Over subsequent years, they modified the name and ownership arrangement, but family members consistently occupied senior positions, meaning they were the perpetrators of the criminal activity from the outset. While this sounds entirely negative, there were actually 2 separate fraud periods, one throughout the 1970s and another during the 1980s. Curiously, these 2 phases were virtually opposite in nature. The 1970s, tax evasion era. During this period, Crazy Eddie operated as a small private enterprise with 1 location initially, growing to 7 by decade's end. Given these circumstances, their primary fraud motivation was simple tax evasion. The Antar family preferred keeping their earnings rather than remitting them to the government. Since businesses pay taxes on profits, their objective was illegally minimizing their apparent profitability. Their principal technique was fairly straightforward: skimming. Remember, this was the 1970s, so numerous customers paid with cash. At day's end, they should have deposited that cash into the bank, recorded it in their accounting system, and used those figures to calculate taxable income at year-end. However, if you simply pocket that cash or hide it at home, it never gets documented, and you're never required to pay taxes on it, which is obviously illegal, as the law mandates anyone receiving cash payments must report and pay taxes on that income. At Crazy Eddie, they reached a point where they were extracting millions from cash sales and concealing it throughout their residences, reminiscent of Walter White. They even established multiple foreign bank accounts. One Israeli account was later discovered containing over $6 million. They'd use some of those funds to pay employees off the books, making the company appear smaller than reality, thereby reducing their tax liability. This practice meant they were saving on taxes, giving them extra capital that enabled them to sell electronics at lower prices. As their commercials claimed, "We will not be undersold." They offered a price-matching guarantee, matching any competitor's price, and even refunding your money if you found the item cheaper elsewhere within 30 days. They gained an unfair competitive advantage by evading taxes that all their competitors were obligated to pay. Additional schemes involved insurance, warranties, and finding questionable suppliers to circumvent fair trade regulations still in effect, allowing them to illegally reduce prices. But skimming represented their largest fraudulent revenue source. Quick favor before we dive deeper. If you are enjoying the deep dive into the company's documentary, please like and subscribe. The 1980s, investor fraud era. As mentioned, everything shifted in the 1980s when they determined that defrauding investors would prove more profitable than defrauding the government. They were pursuing public company status, which they achieved in 1984. This meant selling partial ownership of Crazy Eddie to public stock market buyers, while Eddie and the Antar family retained majority ownership. Their strategy involved artificially inflating the stock price, which would increase the value of their shares, then selling those shares at inflated values. This is precisely what occurred. Within 2 years of their initial public offering, Crazy Eddie shares traded at 10 times their original value. Along the way, the family sold most of their shares at these inflated prices, pocketing approximately $100 million. When selecting stocks, investors rely heavily on earnings reports. They seek healthy financial statements and strong earnings. Paradoxically, their goal now became the exact inverse of their previous objective. Now, they needed to make their profits appear higher than reality, so investors would purchase their stock. This is why I referenced brilliance earlier. Incredibly, they began committing fraud by committing less fraud. I understand that sounds contradictory, so let me elaborate. Back in 1980, when they were still focused on suppressing profits, they had skimmed $3 million of unreported revenue, essentially removing $3 million from the books and depositing it in an Israeli bank. Then in 1981, wanting their profits to start growing, they accomplished this by skimming slightly less than $3 million. By 1983, they were barely skimming at all. They weren't actually earning more money, but because they weren't removing as much, it appeared they were earning more. The logic makes sense. They were committing new fraud by discontinuing the old fraud. Later, they started reintroducing some of the money they'd previously taken to continue raising those profits. Let me review some additional ways they illegally inflated their reported profits. Fabricated sales. They generated countless fake invoices and claimed the sales had occurred. They could record them in sales figures, claiming they simply hadn't received payment yet, thereby increasing revenue. Inventory overstatement. Another clever approach involved overstating their inventory. Each year, they'd arbitrarily add millions to their inventory balance. When auditors requested to inspect that inventory, they'd either borrow it from suppliers who complied due to business dependency, or simply transfer their inventory between locations, so it would be counted multiple times. They'd stack it strategically to create the illusion of greater quantity, successfully reporting far more inventory than they possessed. Timing manipulation. Regarding sales reporting, they'd include some transactions that occurred after the fiscal year ended, claiming a VCR sold in early 1987 was actually sold in late 1986, inflating those 1986 sales. Same-store sales inflation. If you follow this channel, you've heard me discuss comparable store sales comparing each store's performance to the previous year. I mention it because it's an effective success measure and commonly influences investor decisions about purchasing company stock. In this instance, they maintain strong relationships with electronics manufacturers, enabling them to earn extra money by purchasing at low discounted prices and reselling to other retailers, essentially acting as wholesalers. Then they'd report those sales as retail sales at their store locations, intentionally misclassifying them to inflate their same-store sales figures. At this stage, it's clear that Crazy Eddie's financial statements bore little resemblance to the actual business. Investors were examining these statements, trusting their accuracy, and purchasing stock based on them. A major question arises: what about the auditors who reviewed all these statements and certified their accuracy? Why didn't they detect any of this? For that answer, I'd point to Eddie's cousin, Sam Antar, Chief Financial Officer of Crazy Eddie, and essentially the mastermind orchestrating all this fraud. These statements sound terrible, but the company literally financed his college education so he could learn how to commit more sophisticated fraud. Upon graduation, he passed the CPA examination, a very challenging test, and started working at the auditing firm that audited Crazy Eddie at the time. Obviously, that's a massive conflict of interest, so Crazy Eddie began paying him off the books so the firm wouldn't discover it. During his tenure there, Sam learned everything about audit procedures. He learned effective fraud techniques and methods for deceiving auditors. In 1984, when the company went public, Sam left that firm and returned to Crazy Eddie as CFO, where he would commit and conceal the fraud. He claims he would intentionally distract auditors to waste their time and force them to rush through audit sections. They'd hire the auditors for consulting services, as well the additional business would potentially give them incentive to overlook irregularities. Their own employees were instructed to lie about inventory counts and even manually obtain the auditor's work papers and alter some figures. Sam Antar is an intelligent individual and, from my perspective, is the primary reason they succeeded for as long as they did. The downfall. In the late 1980s, everything deteriorated at Crazy Eddie. Electronics prices were rising. Competition intensified, right when they were pursuing an overly aggressive expansion strategy. That combination helped cause the stock price to decline. Shareholders then successfully seized control of the company, and, as the new owners with complete access, they obviously quickly discovered what was happening. The company went bankrupt shortly thereafter. From there, Sam proved very cooperative. He disclosed everything, pleaded guilty, testified against Eddie, and received only minor penalties. He spent a few months under house arrest and lost his CPA license. For Eddie, of course, things were far crazier. He fled to Israel for several years, where he was eventually captured and extradited to the United States. At his trial's conclusion, he received a 12.5-year prison sentence. Then the judge was found to be biased during the trial, so the conviction was overturned. Instead of a retrial, he seized the opportunity to plead guilty in exchange for an 8-year prison sentence. He then served additional time before being released in 1999. As if all that wasn't crazy enough, perhaps the boldest move of all came in 2001 when he attempted to revive the business with similar advertising, but this time as an internet company without any physical locations. It obviously failed. To conclude the story of Crazy Eddie, he died in 2016 at age 68. Let me know in the comments what you think of Crazy Eddie. To me, this seems like one of the more dangerous fraud cases because externally, everything appeared so fun and friendly. I'll admit that if I were living in New York in the 1980s and naturally didn't know about everything happening behind the scenes, I'd probably have loved this place. I'm glad I didn't have the opportunity to invest in Crazy Eddie because it would have been tempting. They were able to recover over $100 million from various bank accounts and distribute it to the deceived investors, but it's still frightening to consider. Speaking of frightening, now that I've discussed it, would you agree with my characterization here, or do you have different thoughts? Any other observations about Crazy Eddie? Leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching.